Chapter 1301, New Life. Through the eyes of mystery prying, Bernadette saw that the interior of the dark red baldachin was empty. Nothing was there. All she could see were shadows that usually shrouded things in reality. She was unable to prophesize anything from it. Having no choice but to look away, she followed her intuition and made the invisible servant walk towards the other end of the open area, which was also part of the primitive forest, filled with towering trees. As the invisible servant couldn't be too far away from her, she silently followed behind while wearing the invisibility hat. She unhurriedly passed through the area where all the creatures on the island were gathered. Here, the sky seemed to be perpetually gloomy, one permeated by a faint blackness. Time passed quickly. The invisible servant entered the forest that blotted out the sky with the tree branches and everything before it suddenly dimmed. Right on the heels of that, the nearly transparent, cold, and undetectable eyes of mystery prying saw through the dim environment. There were pale white corpses placed in between the trees. Skulls and rotting corpses hung down from many branches. They consisted of dragons, avian creatures, and some had 8 legs, while others were strange giant trees that occupied every empty spot in the forest. At a glance, Bernadette seemed to have arrived at a cemetery. A scene naturally surfaced in her mind. It was a scene of supernatural beings giving birth to their descendants before they died, thus passing on their beyonder characteristics to them. And these creatures would struggle towards this region in the primitive forest from every direction, in search of an unoccupied spot. Then, facing a particular direction, they would silently die, gradually rotting and being reduced to bones. What's the meaning behind this? As a clairvoyant, Bernadette fully believed that the scenes produced in her mind were what had happened in the real world. However, she was puzzled about the type of power that made the creatures on this primitive island choose this area as their tomb. Furthermore, since Grimm, William, and Polly, who had died long ago, appeared to remain alive in some form, it didn't make sense that supernatural and mutated creatures that had stayed on this island all this while and had suffered even more corruption would end up dying. This made Bernadette frown slightly as she directed the invisible servant to continue proceeding deeper into the creature's cemetery. Just like that, the invisible servant proceeded forward for nearly 15 minutes in this forest, filled with bones and corpses. Finally, it saw a 4th object beyond trees, weeds, and corpses. It was a black stone pillar. It was very thick, with a width spanning about 6 arm spans and 30 to 40 meters tall. Its surface was covered with rings which were signs of weathering. It resembled a finger wearing rings that didn't suit its size. Bernadette made the eyes of mystery prying observe the stone pillar for several seconds, but she didn't discover anything mysterious about it. It was as though it was a symbol that was casually erected. The invisible servant looked around and discovered that the surrounding corpses around the stone pillar didn't suffer from serious rot. They were even covered in rather intact flesh and skin.
There aren't any supernatural powers or magical effects that are different from other places. Unless the new deceased were gathered near the stone pillar, it's impossible for them to have such a unified trend.
Bernadette suspected that it wasn't because there was no mysterious influence in this matter, but that it would only happen at a specific moment. She didn't use her powers of prophecy to search for the reason. This was because a prophecy at its core was to pry into the secrets of the river of fate. The more serious the problem involved was, and the higher her status and level, the more damage the backlash would bring to her. And at this moment, it was impossible for Bernadette to not be cautious. She was afraid that it might involve an unknown existence. In addition, this hadn't caused any harm to her. She didn't have to take the risk to make a prophecy. After searching for a while to no avail, the invisible servant continued forward, attempting to pass through the cemetery and head to other regions of the forest. Just then, Bernadette heard a rustling sound. It was the sound of a breeze passing through the vegetation, a tidal wave in the void. Ever since she landed on this strange island, this was Bernadette's first time feeling the wind. Subconsciously, she made the invisible servant look back at the black stone pillar. In the eyes of mystery prying, the corpses around the stone pillar began to rot and shed one by one. New flesh and blood grew out like they had their own spirituality, and their skin slowly covered this harrowing scene 1 inch at a time. This change lasted for less than 10 seconds before stopping. A small number of the corpses no longer showed any signs of decay. It looked like they had just died. In the next second, a mutated, curly-haired baboon and a wolf with 8 legs wobbled to their feet. Their fur was slightly white, and their skin was slightly dry, their eyes dull and cold. Then, the 2 originally deceased creatures each got their bearings and left the cemetery from different spots. Bernadette's gaze froze as she watched this. Her brows raised slightly as she finally understood why the creatures on this island had struggled to come to this area before dying, and why they had to die here. Here, death, an endpoint, didn't mean entering the state of eternal slumber, but rather a new beginning. Furthermore, this wasn't the resurrection of a zombie or skeleton that a spirit guide was capable of. It was a new life, with a certain will and vitality.
A distortion and disorder of the world's underlying rules? In addition, it seems to contain some mystery from the Black Emperor's resurrection. However, those who obtain new life aren't in a proper state. They're even closer to zombies. Such revivals are very problematic.
Klein, who was above the gray fog, also saw this scene and had many guesses. Of course, this was under the premise that the emperor had fundamentally left his last mausoleum here and exerted some form of influence here. As he thought about it, Klein rejected this idea. This was because, before the emperor became an angel, this primitive island had a similar situation. The dead Grimm was proof.
Yes, the exact details that happened back then might not be the same as what's happening now. Perhaps, compared to the past, it has already been distorted and disordered.
Klein nodded gently, prepared to bless and protect Bernadette at any time. Bernadette also came up with a guess. She didn't allow the invisible servant to stay in its spot, to wait for a new tide of life. This was because she had foreseen a development. After being repeatedly affected by the new tide of life, the invisible servant would oddly develop some sort of sentience and come alive. In addition, it wasn't that the invisible servant hadn't done any investigation prior to this, but it had ultimately failed to discover anything special about the black stone pillar. Bernadette didn't believe that it would gain anything new by remaining here. In such a situation, it was better to establish a basic understanding of the primitive island, rather than alarming an unknown existence due to a deeper study. Many a time there were problems that eluded one in the beginning, but the answer might be nearer to the end. This was thanks to the experience that Bernadette had accumulated over all these years. The corpses on the trees and branches gradually grew fewer as the invisible servant moved forward. During this process, Bernadette discovered another phenomenon. In the new tide of life, it wasn't certain that a corpse would be revived. However, once they revived and left the empty area, the rest of the corpses would be attracted like metal to magnets in the next 5 minutes. They would stiffly move towards the center, filling up the corresponding spots like they were in line for a bestowment.
The law of beyonder characteristics? Convergence? No, it doesn't seem like it. The deceased have already passed down their characteristics? It's impossible for the deceased to produce new beyonder characteristics after obtaining new life, but do they still possess their powers in their previous lives?
As Bernadette's thoughts wandered, she suddenly thought of a question.
Once I have a complete grasp of the situation on this island, I can find a resurrected being to test it out.
Bernadette quickly made a decision and followed the invisible servant's route forward. She didn't use any beyonder powers other than her invisibility hat. She hoped that she wouldn't disturb the environment and miss out on any details. Therefore, she didn't walk too fast. She took about 15 minutes to leave the cemetery. The invisible servant had already entered the forest up ahead. It could hear the occasional bird chirping and beast roars. The vibrant vitality here was different from the other remaining regions. Above the gray fog, Klein sighed.
Thankfully, I am now the owner of Saphira Castle. Here, I have the status of a king of angels. I can observe reality for as long as I want to, and I don't have to worry about draining my spirituality. Yes, the only thing I need to pay attention to is my body that's hidden in the ancient city, located in the fog of history before the first epoch.
After traveling for another few minutes, the invisible servant suddenly saw something that appeared incongruous to the primitive island's environment. It was a log cabin that seemed to be a residence of a forest ranger. The log cabin was brown in color and was less than 2.5 meters tall. It looked like it was prepared for humans, but every detail was rough and crude. At that moment, the cabin's door was open, allowing Bernadette to see the situation inside through the eyes of mystery prying. A wooden table, a fur-covered bed, and a low-back chair formed a scene of a residence lived by humans.
Who lives here?
With a thought from Bernadette, the invisible servant rapidly approached the cabin in search for possible clues. It then realized that the interior of the cabin was ice cold. Apart from the furniture, there was nothing else. It seemed like no one had lived there for a very long time. Just as Bernadette was using the eyes of mystery prying to carefully inspect every detail in the cabin, she suddenly had a premonition. She hurriedly made the invisible servant turn around. At some point in time, a person had appeared behind the invisible servant. He was wearing luxurious clothes from the Roselle era. His hair was completely white, and he looked old. He had a pair of light blue eyes that were extremely cold and blank. Edwards. This was the knight who had outlived the emperor, Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina's ancestor. Edwards stared at the invisible servant for a few seconds. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and said in a low voice, "Our Highness." Chapter 1302, The Scene and the Prophecy. Bernadette fell silent for 2 seconds before replying through the invisible servant.
Uncle Edwards, why are you here?
She used the way she addressed him when she was young to reduce the chances of an accident. Her voice reverberated in the surrounding air with the invisible servant as a conduit. It was dry, dull, and completely different from normal. Edwards's face was pale. It was as if he had just crawled out of the grave without any warmth. "I don't know either. When I woke up, I discovered that I had returned to this island. This might be my destiny, a destiny of guarding His Majesty." He paused with every word he said, but he didn't give the impression that he was out of breath. It seemed like he hadn't spoken for a long time, so much so that his throat was rusty. He wasn't used to speaking. Without waiting for Bernadette's further inquiries, the knight, who was famous across the continent more than 100 years ago, added with a flat tone, "His Majesty's mausoleum is nearby. I've been guarding this place, waiting for him to revive. But after so many years, the mausoleum has never changed. There haven't been any signs of a resurrection." Bernadette made the invisible servant look around and said,
This log cabin is where you live?
Edward's exposed skin was slightly shriveled. It matched the aging spots he originally had. His voice was low and hoarse as he answered, "That's right. I used the surrounding trees to make materials to build this cabin." Bernadette's invisible servant looked in the direction where she had come from.
Uncle William and the others aren't with you?
Edwards's cold, wooden eyes moved. "They have long been corrupted and are dead. Although they've come back to life, they're more like monsters. They aren't their former selves. Your Highness, you must be wary of them and avoid them. Do not trust anyone but Benjamin and me." Bernadette fell silent for a while before asking through the invisible servant,
Where's my father's mausoleum? I want to take a look.
Edwards's somewhat stiff neck moved. "Okay." He then took a step towards the cabin and took out a rusted black axe. Edwards said, as he looked at the invisible servant that normally couldn't be seen, "I'll take you there." During this process, his expression was stiff and almost unchanged. Along the periphery of the forest, Bernadette responded using the invisible servant to make her hoarse voice echo in the surroundings.
All right.
Edwards was almost 1.9 meters tall, and he looked rather thin. He carried his axe and walked behind the log cabin before saying in a flat tone, "It's very close. Be careful along the way." Bernadette immediately controlled the invisible servant and made it follow the luxuriously dressed Edwards. Walking through the forest one after another, Bernadette suddenly made the invisible servant ask,
Uncle Edwards, What were you worshipping in the empty space from before?
Edwards didn't turn his head as he maintained the same pace. His Majesty. At least 2 kilometers behind him and the invisible servant, Bernadette immediately pricked up her brows. She took nearly 3 seconds to control her emotions. Through the invisible servant, she continued asking without any emotion,
Uncle William and the others are worshipping him?
Edwards paused, but he kept his back towards the invisible servant and the eyes of mystery prying. No. He slowed down as though he was thinking of an answer. I don't know what they worship. Bernadette's eyes narrowed slightly, as though she could see some changes in the river of fate. She didn't ask any more questions as she made the invisible servant silently follow Edwards. Amidst the dark green, towering trees and the black, sharp shrubs, they headed for the island's mountain peak. In just 4 or 5 minutes, the trees up ahead disappeared. This wasn't a process that went from dense to sparse until there was nothing. Instead, the towering trees suddenly disappeared after an imaginary boundary line. Beyond the invisible line was a mountain that was hundreds of meters tall. It was covered by dark green trees that were almost black in color. From afar, it was almost as if it was one with the forest, virtually inseparable. However, the side of the mountain facing Edward and Bernadette was mostly without vegetation. Half of the mountain had been excavated. In the middle of the mountain, a pitch-black mausoleum stood there, with a majestic appearance. Most of it was part of the mountain range. A small portion of it had signs of man-made constructions and polishing. It truly expounded on what it meant to be a mountain mausoleum. Thus, the mausoleum didn't look like the common pyramid. Instead, it looked more like a towering mountain. It wasn't exactly symmetrical, but it was definitely majestic. Perhaps the mausoleum itself had influenced its surroundings, or perhaps Edwards had cleaned the area. Its surface was void of weeds, nor was it covered with vines commonly seen in other mountains. This allowed Bernadette to see the various texts and symbols engraved on the mausoleum through the eyes of mystery prying. She saw the heavy 30-meter-tall stone door that seemed to be prepared for giants. Bernadette wasn't unfamiliar with those words and symbols. She didn't take much time to recognize them as either the civil code that was created by her father, the new social trends that he had established, or even some design drafts of some invention. Just as Bernadette was carefully examining it, Klein, who was above the gray fog, was completely certain that this was the last mausoleum left behind by Emperor Roselle. This was similar to the mausoleum he had seen in the Tudor ruins. It had the majesticness and distortion traits of the Black Emperor. After walking out of the primitive forest and passing through the invisible boundary, they arrived near the mausoleum. Edward stopped. He half turned his body and aimed his pale face and cold eyes at the invisible servant. He said without any change in his voice, "Don't go in. It will interrupt the resurrection." Bernadette frowned slightly and thought for 2 seconds before using the eyes of mystery prying to lock onto the mausoleum. Then, her blue eyes that resembled the sea became extremely deep, like the surface of the sea before a storm. Under such circumstances, her eyes clearly lost focus as her vision turned blurry. She was prying into the secrets of the river of fate and making a prophecy for what would happen next. Klein tapped the long-modeled table and increased the probability of her success. He then prepared himself to resist the corruption of the cosmos. Of course, the latter wasn't necessary, because Bernadette had a Grade 0 sealed artifact that she could control. Bernadette raised her right hand the next second. Her skin instantly turned as white as snow, her lips turned as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. An illusory, ancient mirror appeared in her hands. This was Snow White of her fairy tale magic. Bernadette had used it to enhance the success rate and accuracy of her prophecy. Silently, she saw a scene. The majestic and solemn dark mausoleum visibly shook as the tall, heavy stone door opened. Then, a huge black arm stretched out from the stone door. The style of this arm was close to that of the trees on the island. From its color and state, it looked more like a part of a shadow. However, it wasn't a thin layer, but was instead filled with flesh and blood. It looked extremely strange. It supported itself with its elbows and moved forward with great difficulty, as though it wanted to pull out bigger and more terrifying parts from within. The entire island began to shake. Boom! The transparent eyes of mystery prying suddenly shattered. Bernadette's eyes immediately closed, as if she had seen a blinding light or encountered some unbearable damage. Blood trickled down from the corners of her eyes as the color in her face drained significantly. On her body, a pair of illusory and holy wings spread out, descending upon her with its clean, white feathers to neutralize the invisible corruption.
Indeed, she has the ability to resist. The Emperor sure left a huge inheritance for her. Before I taught Ma'am Hermit a lesson, she liked to use the eye of mystery prying to examine the people and objects around her. It definitely has something to do with how she was brought up. In short, it's all Roselle's fault.
Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he couldn't help but criticize the Emperor. Then his mind raced as he analyzed the scene that Bernadette had prophesied.
A terrifying creature crawls out from the mausoleum after the stone door is opened. This might be the resurrected Roselle, or perhaps a symbol of some kind of disaster. For example, a particular outer deity who had once corrupted this island, or the primordial moon who secretly corrupted Roselle. Yes, even if it's Roselle, he definitely wouldn't be taking on the form of a human. He's even closer to that of a mythical creature, a deity. Also, I can't be sure if the terrifying creature is rational or if it can communicate. There's another important problem. Was the stone door opened by Bernadette or someone else? Or did the terrifying creature in the mausoleum do it by itself? If it's the latter, things might develop to the stage of the prophecy even if we don't do a thing. A prophecy is truly filled with ambiguity.
Klein conjured a gold coin and flicked it, making a divination. The results of the dream divination showed that the mausoleum was both dangerous and safe.
How do I interpret this?
As Klein pondered, he focused his attention back on Bernadette. Bernadette took nearly a minute to recover and stopped appearing that week. However, she was temporarily unable to interpret the direction of the prophecy from the scene she saw. She could only confirm that the problem was definitely very complicated. Due to the eyes of mystery prying shattering, there was no way for her to use it, to see the various secrets. All she could do was use the invisible servant's perception to observe the situation around her. She realized that Edwards remained silent and motionless when she was unable to control the invisible servant, as though he hadn't noticed anything abnormal. After some thought, Bernadette said to Edwards through the invisible servant,
Do you still remember the years you spent in Lindbergh?
Edwards' indifferent blue eyes moved. I remember. Cool, I think. At this point, he seemed to recall something. His expression twisted as though he was suffering some indescribable pain. In such a state, his eyes suddenly glowed with a strange light. I think I'm already dead. Chapter 1303, Coming to Life. Already dead. Edwards turned his head and looked at Bernadette's invisible servant with his light blue eyes. His gaze was no longer cold and blank. It emitted a strange glint that was filled with disbelief. It was only at this moment that he seemed to realize that he had long died and had come back to life. He was no different from William, Polly, and Grimm, who he claimed were individuals who they needed to keep up one's guard against. This transformation lasted for only 2 seconds before Edwards's face twisted. His already pale skin rapidly dimmed as it ruptured inch by inch. Beneath his skin, the red pieces of flesh began to rot at a discernible speed, dripping foul yellow liquid. With a swoosh, Edwards raised the black axe in his hand. Oof! His axe ruthlessly cleaved the top of his head, as though it was trying to stop the bad thoughts that surfaced in his mind. The axe was heavy and sharp. It tore through Edwards's skull, all the way to his glabella. Drip, drip, drip. Drops of milky white cerebrospinal fluid dripped down from the axe's blade. sliding across Edwards's grimaced and torn face, as though he had poured some milk onto a bright red strawberry. Edwards said in a low and hoarse voice to Bernadette's invisible servant, after striking himself in the head, "Don't come near me." Before he could finish his sentence, his expression returned to its blank state. The look in his eyes gradually turned hollow as he turned around and walked towards the forest. That thin and shriveled body of his stooped a little, as though his back was hunched. Bernadette had probed him because of the doubts and concerns she had about entering the mausoleum. All she could do was indirectly determine the problem with Edwards's existence and see if she could obtain more clues from his answer. She never expected this knight from Roselle's era, who had been famous across the northern continent, would react in such an intense and strange manner. After 2 seconds of silence, Bernadette made the invisible servant say to Edwards's back,
Your descendants are doing pretty well. All of them are accomplished in a certain sense.
Edwards, whose back was facing the mausoleum, stopped for a moment. Then he continued forward, passing the invisible boundary and entering the forest. His target seemed to be in the direction of the cemetery with the stone pillar, the place where the deceased could obtain new life. At the same time, Bernadette looked up into the sky. The faint black colors that permeated the area had clearly faded, but there was an indescribable feeling. The entire primitive island underwent a subtle change that couldn't accurately be described. Suddenly, Bernadette, who was hiding at the edge of the invisible boundary, rubbed her back. She felt that it was heavy, as though there was something there. When her left palm touched her target, Bernadette realized that there was an extra strand of hair. At this moment, she was wearing an Inta-style blouse with a large lace flower around the collar, an indigo-patterned captain's uniform, a pair of beige trousers, knee-length boots, and a triangular hat with feathers on it. She was dressed like the leader of a pirate ship. She styled herself such that her long chestnut hair was tied into a bun, leaving the remaining strands in a way that would reach the middle of her back. But now, even though her hairstyle remained unchanged, her hair had grown longer and reached her waist. Then, Bernadette lowered her head and looked at her right palm. She saw the fingernails of her 5 fingers extending. Queen Mystic didn't show any signs of surprise or panic. She followed the instincts of a clairvoyant, and from all the experience she had accumulated over time. She took a few steps forward, and through an invisible boundary, she completely left the primitive forest and entered the empty area where the Black Emperor's mausoleum was. During this process, Bernadette even made the invisible servant return to the spirit world. 3 or 4 seconds later, she felt the earth shake. The mausoleum began to tremble visibly. Subconsciously, Bernadette turned to look at the primitive forest. Her gaze froze for a moment. The dark green trees were waving their branches and uprooting their roots. Then, like humans, they approached Bernadette. The entire primitive forest had come to life. Looking at the dense cluster of trees that seemed to blot out the sky surging at her, Bernadette had the feeling that doomsday was approaching. She felt as if the entire area would be blanketed by the forest. A gigantic red dragon with flames flowing across its skin rapidly flew into the sky. An 8-legged demonic wolf began to run madly between the trees. All the supernatural beings and mutated creatures on this island stirred as they rushed towards the mausoleum. Although she was a clairvoyant, Bernadette still didn't expect that her simple, indirect question would bring about such an anomaly. It was as though it was a key that had opened the door to the abyss. Above the gray fog, Klein saw a lot more. Together with his knowledge of mysticism, he had a certain guess.
The situation of Edwards is different from William, Grimm, and Polly. It's like a loophole of the order on this primitive island, or rather, a shadow. When he realized that he was already dead, this loophole was discovered by the order, and it began to conduct repairs. And the repairs brought with it an enhancement of the order, causing the entire island to experience an anomaly. I can sense that the Black Emperor's powers are present here to a certain degree. It affected Edwards, causing him to maintain a portion of his will after obtaining new life. And where did the original order of this primitive island come from? Eh?
As Klein's thoughts raced, he suddenly sensed that Bernadette was suffering certain anomalies. Thump, thump, thump. Bernadette could vaguely hear her own heartbeat. This heartbeat was rather chaotic, as though it was a combination of two sounds.
2.
Bernadette's heart stirred as she calmly directed her attention back to herself. In the next second, she confirmed that there were two sources of her heartbeat. One came from her heart, the other from her abdomen. There seemed to be an additional heart in her abdomen, one that was rapidly expanding and contracting. Furthermore, this heart was developing bit by bit. Without needing to use her mystery prying powers to look at her abdomen, Bernadette immediately sensed that there was a fetus in her womb. It had grown from the size of a grape to the size of a normal human palm. If it was left to grow, it didn't seem like it would take long before it matured. It would then tear open her mother's womb and drill out while covered in blood. Unknowingly, Bernadette had become pregnant. Her spiritual perception and the sealed artifact on her body had failed to detect it in advance or attempt to stop it. It was as though she was powerless to deal with such an influence. 3 divine names flashed through Bernadette's mind.
Earth Mother, Primordial Moon, Mother Tree of Desire.
According to what she knew, there weren't many mysteries that could cause such an anomaly. Most of them came from domains related to the Earth and the Moon pathway. Sequence 0 of the plantar pathway was Mother. The primordial moon could make a stone have reproductive powers, while the Mother Tree of Desire seemed to possess some high sequence beyond her characteristics of the moon pathway. Bernadette wasn't in a hurry to deal with the fetus in her stomach. Her gaze turned dark once again as she used her prophetic ability to see what her best choice was. This time, she only took 1 second to obtain the corresponding prophecy.
Survival lies inside the mausoleum.
Without any hesitation, Bernadette reached out her right hand and quickly drew out words filled with stellar radiance. These words, which were similar to the words on the blasphemy slate, quickly interwove into a strange symbol and opened a secret door that seemed to lead deep into the spirit world. Following that, the secret door opened and a strong gust of wind blew out, transforming into an entity that was half man, half air. His upper body was wrapped in white cloth. Bernadette's tone was calm as she ordered in a dignified voice,
Sage Frontlet.
The man responded respectfully and removed an accessory from the white cloth wrapped around his body. The core of this accessory was a vertical eye embedded with diamonds. It shimmered with pure light, exuding an abnormal holiness. It was filled with intelligence, but it also appeared cold, without any warmth. Bernadette then took the accessory and embedded it into the middle of her forehead. This was a Grade 0 sealed artifact, which Bernadette usually didn't carry with her, as the negative effects were too severe. However, at this moment, the Sage Frontlet had an ability that was extremely important to Bernadette. She was willing to bear the consequences of not being able to use evil magic and the gradual influence that the Beyonder characteristic would have on her as it slowly fused with her. If she didn't remove the Sage Frontlet in a short period of time, it would be equivalent to having a Sequence 2 potion splashed on her. When the time came, she could either end up lucky and succeed in advancing to become a sage, or lose control and become a monster. And without the supplementary ingredients and the corresponding ritual, the former's probability was nearly negligible. With the diamond vertical eye on her forehead, Bernadette's body began to turn incorporeal as she dissociated into a series of complicated knowledge. In that instant, she became a creature of pure information. The baby in her womb failed to obtain such a state as it fell to the ground. It was half the size of a normal baby. It already had facial features and limbs. Its skin was wrinkled, and it was dripping with sticky pus. As it left its mother's body, the undeveloped it began to regress and quickly melted in the air. The baby was clearly unwilling to give up. It tried its best to open its eyes, which were sealed by the sticky liquid. It opened its mouth wide open in a bid to make a final struggle. At this moment, Klein, who was above the gray fog, rapped the edge of the long, mottled table. Pah! He increased the probability of failure with respect to the baby's struggling. Unable to maintain itself, the baby completely dissipated in front of the approaching black forest. At the same time, the flood of information that Bernadette had transformed into had entered the Black Emperor Mausoleum's interior through the heavy stone door as she reformed her original body. During this process, she seemed to see a black shadow. Chapter 1304, The Importance of Ideas. When she entered the Black Emperor's mausoleum, Bernadette vaguely saw a black shadow. However, after she extricated herself from being an embodiment of information and reassembled her body with the pure, messy knowledge, she didn't sense anything. It was as though what she had just experienced was just an illusion. Queen Mystic wasn't in a rush to venture deep into the mausoleum. She stayed in her spot and carefully observed her surroundings. Without using the powers of mystery prying, everything was clearly presented before her eyes. The interior of the Black Emperor Mausoleum was empty. Apart from the pitch-black walls and the high platform in the middle, there was nothing. On the high platform, there was a chair that looked like it was prepared for a giant. It was made of iron, and its surface was engraved with complicated and distorted patterns. At the top of the seat, there was a crown-shaped object. At this moment, there wasn't a single figure on the huge, heavy seat, as if it was waiting for its emperor to return. Just as Bernadette was about to take a step forward and approach the platform, she suddenly realized that her body was completely immobilized, as if she was being bound tightly by invisible shackles. Right on the heels of that, pairs of illusory and wholly white wings appeared behind her as though they were passively resisting something. In the next second, on the pairs of angel wings, white feathers dropped as they fluttered. They grew deformed, thin, and fluffy limbs. The gaps in the layers of feathers spread open one after another, as though they had become countless eyes. The deformed feathers immediately let out crisp laughter, causing a hollow chuckle to echo inside the mausoleum. All of them had come alive, turning into miniature winged creatures. This reminded Bernadette of some fairy tales that her father had told her. There were always little pixies that weren't as big as a thumb in them. As this thought flashed through her mind, Bernadette felt her right eye itch. The eyelashes of that eye grew rapidly, turning into tiny arms that took root on her face, trying hard to pull her eyeball out. The veins in Bernadette's right eye protruded as they let out a childlike voice, as though they had gained sentience and consciousness of her body. "I see it! I see it!" This was also a form of new life. Almost at the same time, Bernadette's left ear suddenly drooped down and covered her ears. The ear shouted with a sharp voice, "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it." If she didn't use her spirituality, Bernadette would definitely imagine that she had a young maiden by her side, one that was covering her ears, stamping her feet, and screaming. Without cushioning anything, the sage frontlet in the middle of her forehead automatically left her body and floated into the air. The surface of the vertical eye, embedded with diamonds, instantly flashed with countless cold beams of light. It was as though numerous tiny eyes had grown out of it. Each eye reflected Bernadette. The sage frontlet had also obtained a certain living characteristic. Just as the Grade 0 sealed artifact was about to awaken and affect its target, a pale white, slender, illusory palm reached out and grabbed it. The sage frontlet's living characteristic rapidly dispersed, as though it had reached the end of its life. The ice-cold and pale hand that clearly belonged to a woman came from behind Bernadette. At some point in time, a figure with only an upper body appeared. This figure grew out of Bernadette's back. It was almost transparent and rather illusory. She was wearing the same clothing as Bernadette, and she was wearing the same feather triangular hat. Her blue eyes were like the projection of the ocean. It was like Bernadette herself, a part of her spirit that had drilled out of her body. However, there was a pale white face mask on Bernadette's half-body phantom. The mask only had holes where one's eyes were, with no other gaps elsewhere. This made Bernadette's phantom appear extremely cold and noble, but it lacked the aura of a living being. This was the third item she possessed, and also her last Grade 0 sealed artifact. It was an item made after Emperor Roselle returned from the southern continent in his later years, called Pale Death. Its negative effect was to make the wearer slowly die until it became a corpse and become its slave. At this moment, Bernadette had used this point to restrain the abnormal life growing in her. Just as the half-body phantom appeared, her right eye quelled. Her eyelashes, which had turned thicker and longer into arms, began to fall off one by one. Her ears didn't make any noises either. They slowly opened and returned to normal. Without such a suppression, Bernadette's facial features, arms, and legs would have broken apart to seek freedom. After stabilizing her body, Bernadette tried to take a step forward. However, she was still unable to do anything. All she could do was control the half-bodied spirit body. After some thought, she made the spirit body behind her take out a ritual silver dagger from her pocket. Then, bending down, it drew a circle in the middle of her right boot. With a ripping sound, the leather boot quickly shortened by half. Then, Bernadette used her half-body spirit body to tear her pants near her left knee. She cut off a corner of her coat and blouse, removing one of the feathers on the side of her triangular hat. This attempt didn't seem to have anything to do with supernatural beings. It was just like a willful and rebellious girl who wanted to dress up in a different way from the normal sense of aesthetics. However, as Bernadette completed this series of actions, she carefully took a step forward. Her body could actually move, as she no longer felt restrained. The invisible suppression effect vanished instantly. The Black Emperor Mausoleum seemed to accept Bernadette in this form. Who would have thought that something an ordinary person could do was able to deal with such abnormalities? Furthermore, Bernadette suspected that the more she used her beyond her powers to resist whatever she was facing, the deeper the effects. This was because she had the feeling that she was facing an invisible deity. Only by pleasing the other party's sense of aesthetics could she be pardoned. Otherwise, she could only rely on the authority of a sequence 0 to circle around it. In addition, the lucky thing was that Bernadette wasn't once a knowledgeable mysticologist, but she also had a deep understanding of the Black Emperor pathway. She knew what the authorities this domain consisted of. She knew that it represented the shadow of order, a distortion of order. That was why Bernadette twisted the normal order around her, using her dressing, thus obtaining the recognition and acceptance of the invisible deity. Yes, in the matter regarding mysticism, knowledge and ideas are more useful than abilities at times. In that situation just now, any resistance would have been viewed as a provocation towards the internal order of the mausoleum, triggering unpredictable and terrifying changes. Once one figures out the crux of the problem, the negative effects will be easily resolved. Klein nodded above the gray fog and learned quite a lot from Queen Mystic. Although he was already a sequence higher than her, to the point of being a king of angels inside Saphira Castle and having experienced quite a number of major events, his growth had been too fast. He was still lacking when it came to the details and problems. Now was the perfect time to make up for the deficiency through observation. After taking a step, Bernadette began to follow her spiritual intuition and walk toward the huge, empty chair on the platform. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Suddenly, a breeze blew past her neck. This cold wind made Bernadette's body turn numb. At that moment, she felt a black shadow appear behind her. Silently, her long chestnut-colored hair parted, revealing a pair of eyes on her scalp. It was a pair of eyes without any eyelashes. They were almost transparent, cold and heartless. Eyes of mystery prying. The pair of eyes turned slightly and saw that the shadow-like curtain in the mysterious world showed clear signs of distortion. However, it didn't notice the shadow, nor did it find the source of the cold wind. Just as Bernadette attempted to close the eyes of Mystery Prior and lower the possibility of an accident, the cold and sinister breeze suddenly appeared in her mind. Her thoughts became active as she became increasingly out of control. She was unable to direct her thoughts in the required manner. This seemed to be a trend that couldn't be changed, one that led to chaos. Without any hesitation, Bernadette grabbed the few seconds of thought she was capable of. She let the half-body spirit on her back remove the pale white mask. Then, she put pale death on her face, while the half-body spirit retracted into her body and fused with her. From this second onwards, Bernadette's thoughts would gradually die along with her body. However, her thoughts could not help but stir and turn chaotic. Both of these conflicting conditions offset one another, forming a weak and delicate balance that helped Bernadette regain her ability to think. To Bernadette, compared to the beyonder effects of pale death itself, its negative effects were even more effective at this moment. Maintaining the balance, Bernadette took a few steps forward. During this process, she always felt that there were shadows hovering around her, but she couldn't find them no matter how hard she tried. After thinking for a few seconds, Bernadette's blue eyes darkened once again, losing focus. She tried prophesying the consequences of her choice. Soon, a corresponding scene appeared before her eyes. After putting on the sage frontlet again, she once again transformed into pure and complicated information streams, using it to circumvent the obstruction and head to the high platform in the middle. However, just as she approached, the flood of information suddenly disintegrated. It lost its order and formed several Bernadettes built on different tenets. There was a young girl in a layered dress, a tall young girl, a melancholic and confused girl, a woman with a twisted and pained expression, and a calm and determined queen. The prophetic vision instantly disappeared, and Bernadette's eyes instantly regained focus. At this moment, she saw the black shadow. It was standing right in front of her, no more than a fist away from her. That face formed from pure shadow completely occupied her vision. Chapter 1305, That Black Shadow. The moment Bernadette saw the black shadow, she instinctively clenched her right hand and conjured an ancient spear. From the tip of the spear to its handle, it was dyed with crimson-red balls. It emitted a strong, destructive aura, as though it could harm a true deity. Spear of Longinus. This spear had once appeared in an ancient era that couldn't be traced back, stained with the blood of a great existence. At this moment, it had descended into the Black Emperor's mausoleum through mystical reenactment. However, when Bernadette thrust it forward, she failed to achieve any effects because the tip of the spear was directed at her back. Despite wanting to attack the black shadow in front of her, the spear of Longinus had strangely thrust backward. The area had been affected by disorder or suffered some form of distortion. Above the gray fog in the palace, Klein noticed the black shadow when it appeared in front of Bernadette. He didn't hesitate to raise the staff of the stars in his hand. He didn't wait this time, unlike his prior observations of Queen Mystic's actions before, where he would consider if he would provide her with protection. This was because the level of danger of the black shadow sounded off alarms within him. He was an angel of the seer pathway, after all. More importantly, Bernadette could sense the shadow's existence after entering the Black Emperor's mausoleum from time to time. As for Klein, he was unable to find clues through the true vision provided by Sapphira Castle. This undoubtedly meant danger and terror. When all the gems embedded in the black cane lit up, the sound of melodious bells resounded in the area where Bernadette and the black shadow were. Gong. The bell that came from an infinite distance exuded an indescribable emptiness. It made the interior of the Black Emperor's mausoleum visibly freeze, turning Bernadette's figure stiff as if she had been frozen. She couldn't do anything. However, the black shadow didn't sink into the vortex of time. As though situated in another world built with completely different fundamental rules, the shadow continued moving forward in between the contradictory of two rivers of fate, one filled with raging torrents and one that was almost completely still. This only made it appear to slow down, in no way affected by the illusory bell. This was the first time Klein had encountered such a situation after he gained the ability to replicate powers. Although the beyonder effects he had replicated with the Staff of the Stars were lacking compared to the original version, it would still be able to show a certain level of authority that wasn't easy to ignore regardless. However, the Black Shadow's slow movements gave him a second chance to try again. This time, he activated the Staff of the Stars' powers and moved Queen Mystic out of the Black Emperor's mausoleum. He wanted her to first conclude what she experienced before considering entering again. Gems flashed on the tip of the staff, and Bernadette, who was almost about to make contact with the black shadow, disappeared into thin air. In the next second, she appeared tens of meters away, appearing near the high platform in the mausoleum. The staff of the stars' teleportation was disrupted. The destination had been distorted, turning everything extremely chaotic. The experienced Bernadette didn't feel any fear or panic because she was stuck inside the Black Emperor mausoleum. She decisively raised her left hand and pressed the sage frontlet in the middle of her forehead as she used her fingers to stroke the pale death mask. The shimmering golden mask suddenly became soft and rapidly squirmed, as if it was about to form a face that didn't belong to Bernadette. The face had soft features and obvious characteristics of a southern continent native, but it exuded a bizarre and terrifying feeling. Anyone who witnessed it would believe that it would come alive once the face became clear enough, an entity that came from ancient times, the eternal darkness where the dead slumbered. By then, Bernadette's body, spirituality, and consciousness would all belong to this face. With the protrusion of this face, the stone walls and floor tiles in the Black Emperor mausoleum began to weather. It happened so fast that thousands of years appeared to be washed away in a short span of 2 seconds. They quickly became mottled, constantly dropping fragments or throwing up dust due to the wind. In between the cracks, thin white fur grew out. In just the blink of an eye, the fur grew into white feathers, and their surface seemed to be soaked in light yellow oil. The aura of the black figure gradually weakened, as though it was running towards death with huge strides. Its color faded away, its movements growing slower. Within the area where the pale white mask was, even the concept of death itself would weather away and dissipate. However, what was labeled as death wasn't the end point. When the stone wall and the floor tiles in the mausoleum were weathered to a certain extent, and when the black figure degraded to a certain stage, new stone blocks began to take form as ethereal auras quickly grew. During this process, the black figure stretched out his right hand. This palm that was formed from shadows suddenly grabbed Bernadette's neck from dozens of meters away. This wasn't fulfilled by extending the arm, but distorting the concept of distance for an instant. 45 meters became equivalent to 45 centimeters. The dark palm didn't exert too much strength, but it made Bernadette feel cold. Under such coldness, she realized that she couldn't use the 2 Grade 0 sealed artifacts of the Sage Frontlet and Pale Death. Typically, as long as she injected her spirituality into it and gave the corresponding thoughts, the sealed artifacts on her would react in the correct manner, creating different effects. But now, the silent process and rules had been disrupted and distorted. No amount of thoughts that Bernadette willed were able to stir the sealed artifacts. It felt like she was speaking to the air. Klein, who was above the gray fog, didn't waste any time after failing to teleport Queen Mystic away. A series of complicated symbols and magic labels quickly formed in his mind. He wanted to replicate a secret sorcerer's space concealment. He planned on separating Bernadette's location from the Black Emperor's mausoleum and concealing it to help Queen Mystic escape her current predicament. In fact, it might be more appropriate replicating the fairy tale magic Peace Blossom source, but considering how Bernadette was formerly a mysticologist, Klein felt that it was better to use space concealment. Otherwise, it might expose some of the fool's secrets. As for where he had learned space concealment from, it naturally came from the recently advanced Fours. Previously, in the name of the world Gehrman Sparrow, Klein had rented Leymano's travels. He had also requested Miss Magician to record the corresponding powers. Then, he released and recorded it while summoning the complete Leymano's travels from the fog of history again and again. It didn't take long for him to grasp the knowledge and technique, allowing him to replicate spatial concealment. As more gems lit up on the staff of the stars, the area around Bernadette darkened, as though it was covered by a curtain weaved by shadows. The curtain distorted as it concealed the space, isolating the black shadow and its palm outside. This helped Bernadette regain her freedom. In the next second, The black palm that had been forcefully separated reached forward again and touched the boundary of the concealed space. In an instant, a transparent vortex-like door appeared in the abnormal void. Or rather, the secret door that originally existed appeared autonomously and opened up in front of the black palm. All concealed space had a door, but the location of the door depended on the creator's thoughts. The palm formed by the shadows rapidly passed through the open door and entered the concealed space. It grabbed Bernadette's neck and once again disrupted the connection between Queen Mystic and her sealed artifact, distorting the corresponding order. At the same time, the black figure raised its head and looked at the top of the mausoleum. It seemed to be studying Saphira Castle and Klein through layers of space and fog. Klein's eyelids twitched instinctively. He sensed that the shadow had a certain understanding of where he was and felt that it was distorting something. Klein's expression unknowingly turned abnormally heavy. The different gems on the staff of the stars lit up at the same time. He wanted to attempt to steal the corresponding beyonder powers of the other party. Only by doing so would he have the chance to restrict the black shadow. And in order to increase the success rate of stealing his target's powers, Klein turned his left palm and tapped the edge of the long modeled table. However, his theft failed. He didn't even get anything. His target had long since escaped the lock-on, despite just standing there. Klein's gaze froze. Then he saw the black figure flash and enter the concealed space, closing the distance between it and Bernadette.
It distorted my true vision, causing the situation I saw to be from 1 or even 2 seconds ago.
A thought flashed through Klein's mind as he made a preliminary judgment on the previous failure. He then decided to summon Will Acceptance historical projection to get him to reboot the area. At that moment, Bernadette, who was unable to use her sealed artifact, grew white illusory swan feathers on her back. This was her fairy tale magic's ugly duckling. It could make Bernadette reveal an incomplete mythical creature form while maintaining her clarity of mind. She could use it twice a day, with each use lasting 15 seconds. At this moment, her thoughts went wild again. They started to boil and become more chaotic. This caused her ugly duckling magic to be cut off before it could even show its effects. Almost at the same time, she saw the black shadow stick to her body. It was sticky like a viscous, corrosive liquid that seeped into her body. Bernadette's eyes darkened as she suddenly sensed something. She grabbed the final moment of lucidity and opened her mouth slightly, speaking in a fluent Chinese accent.
Home.
The black shadow's infiltration paused for a moment. Its upper body slowly rose as it looked at Bernadette.